There's a healthcare system that works for some. There's a healthcare system that doesn't work for others. And so we're trying to focus on the others. We think of ourselves as we're a B2B company. We enable other people's strategy. If there is a diagnostic result required that has friction in that process, so there's barriers, there's economic, there's geographic, there's mistrust barriers, there's stigma barriers, etc. If there's a barrier to care where a diagnostic is required, we want to eliminate that barrier or that friction and get people to have access to a result so that it can lead to a better care journey.
James York's path wasn't a straight line. It was a bold leap from the high-velocity trading floors of Wall Street into the precise, life-altering world of molecular diagnostics. He traded the DNA of market trades for the literal DNA of human health, driven by a realization that the way we access our own biological information needed a fundamental rebuild. Today, as Chief Commercial Officer at Molecular Testing Labs, James is a resilient builder working to construct a new three-legged stool where labs, doctors, and medicine work in perfect, accessible harmony. In this conversation, we explore his transformation from a market strategist to a healthcare pioneer. We invite you into a parallel adventure to look past the complexity of the current system and discover a way to truly own your health journey. This is an invitation to understand your biology, activate your potential, and become the primary decision maker in your own life. James York is the Chief Commercial Officer and Head of Government Affairs at Molecular Testing Labs, where he helps lead a mission-driven effort to expand access to high-quality molecular diagnostics. With a background spanning exercise physiology, financial markets, and healthcare leadership, James brings a systems-level perspective to how biological data is generated, interpreted, and delivered at scale. At Molecular Testing Labs, he oversees the commercial strategy, partnerships, and policy engagement across CLIA-certified and CAP-accredited laboratories, specializing in infectious disease testing, SNP genotyping, and targeted molecular analysis. His leadership focuses on reducing barriers to testing, particularly for the underserved populations, while translating complex molecular insights into tools that empower individuals, clinicians, and public health systems alike. James, welcome to the DNA of Things.
Thank you, Jeremy. I really appreciate you having me.
It's been a pleasure to get to know you. We were introed through Barbara, actually. And I was connected to Barbara through LinkedIn, where we were conversing back and forth on a podcast I'd done previously with Dr. Nathan Price. So got to know Barbara well. And, immediately in our conversation, she had suggested that we get in touch. So it's great to be with you today and at a really exciting time. As we were speaking at the top of the call here, this is a moment where there's a democratization of data that was previously siloed and or near impossible to interpret, given the tools of old. Before we get into this really exciting emergence of access, you have an interesting background, and in as much as the mission is really exciting, it really doesn't make sense without understanding the person associated with it. So I'd love to hear more about your personal journey into Molecular Testing Labs.
Yeah, so we're just going to start right into the truth and get dirty, because
Let's do it.
I wish that I could say I had this 20-year plan, super strategic, and I knew exactly that I was going to end up in molecular diagnostics, but the truth is I did not. So the really long story short is I wanted to be a doctor. And when I went to college, I thought exercise physiology would be the best path for me. So it was a pre-med ex-phys degree. And I wanted to learn how the body works, and especially under stress. So that's the exercise part of it. So just getting a deep understanding of every part of the body, physiology, kinesiology, anatomy, etc. And so, like I said, I was pre-med. I did the MCATs, did all the things to get into medical school, and I ended up not going because I got a job on a trading floor. And so I moved from East Tennessee to Dallas, Texas, and started a job on a trading floor, which, as you can imagine, gave me deep experience in understanding balance sheets, P&Ls, public filings for public companies, etc. We made markets. And so Market maker just means the guy on the floor that reflected bids for all the brokers. So all of those bids and offers stack up, and that's how people buy and sell stock. I did that for about 4.5 to 5 years. And then I decided to get back into my roots into healthcare from a different angle. I did not approach it from the doctor angle. I approached it from the business angle and started working at a number of different healthcare companies. Since that time of getting into the first healthcare company, which was a DME company, I got a good understanding of medical device. I got a good understanding of hospitals, operating rooms, reimbursement strategies, just a real global perspective on everything that kind of, at least from my viewpoint, what worked and what didn't work, which ultimately fed to a decision to chase verticals within healthcare that had declining ASPs. Now, that's a funny way to say what I'm trying to say, but where there's declining ASPs, like where I was in medical device, you see increases in regulation, you see decreases in price, which means that you ultimately see changes in the value proposition of healthcare. The value prop changes, the players that play in the space change. And ultimately, it makes a lot of the salespeople that are in healthcare for the quick buck. It makes them move out and chase some other quick buck, and then you're rooted in a business that is required infrastructure for healthcare. So, taking all the lessons, and I've started a few companies, capitalized a few, operated a few. Ultimately, moved back down to Dallas, Texas, to be the vice president of sales for Orthofix, which is a publicly traded spine company. That's how I got back into Dallas. And then through a series of events from that point forward, I landed into molecular diagnostics. It still met that definition of declining ASP. Diagnostics in general have been a pretty sturdy infrastructure for a long time, but it didn't have any innovation or disruption for the longest amount of time. So going back to 11 years ago, I joined the molecular testing labs team as an owner, and we started to make markets in diagnostics, but we decided to do something very different, which was make diagnostics accessible. And so, like, very clear from the very beginning, being a small lab, we did not want to compete against the Quest and LabCorps of the world, just because they are so established in contracting and lobbying and influence and just supporting the general infrastructure of healthcare. So we did not want to compete against them. And we decided that the best innovation that we could contribute for diagnostics was actually access rather than more complexity of tests and things like that. And so we just started working on how people can collect their sample at home, how they can deliver that sample to a lab and get a result that would ultimately lead to some kind of decision-making tool in their care journey. And so XFIZ to diagnostics, that's how it happened. I'm pretty proud of what we have accomplished because when I first started in this space, Jeremy, I think I had to convince people why to think differently about it. And if you fast forward to today and look at what's happening, diagnostics are actually one of the forefront conversational points in healthcare now, where people are imagining different ways and different workflows to engage and activate their patients. As care moves more towards the home and more towards convenience, then encounters are also moving virtually, and things that you can do from your office or from your home, from your couch. And so just tying off the diagnostics to the virtual care aspect is really intuitive and something that needs to happen.
So interesting how you went from human performance insofar as exercise physiology. I think one of the things you said there was, how the body responds to stress, or understanding a body's, compensation, I would say, to maybe strategic stress is kind of how I think about athletics. Like if you've got a good coach, that is, and you have somebody that I think understands the, first principles of, let's call it acute to chronic training load ratio, and looking for that kind of optimized exposure to an overreaching that doesn't quite break the athlete, but gets them to, super compensate in a way that's conducive to their sport. So I would assume that you went through the physiology training, you're well versed in that. And then you go into, essentially the market making role, which is, really interesting there, being on the trading floor, because there's, it's, similar to a performance system, right? Because you're constraining the performance, let's say artificially, in insofar as cultivating an emergent property, right? And so, in this instance here is there's a market demand. I think you use the word, market creation. I would almost even say it's like, I think there's a creation component, but I also think there's like an identification component, right? So I don't know, to use, an example from, I don't know, you might remember one of the Apple movies there. Steve Jobs is being, essentially like he's launching the first computer, and his the mother of his daughter is just kind of like, I don't understand why would you even do this? Like, why do people need a computer? Um, and then his daughter just kind of draws something, and I think it was paint, and then prints it out. And it's just like kind of a rough drawing, but prints it out. It's like, that's why, right? And you're seeing a version of that today with like Chat GPT and like builders, right? It's like build stuff, right? And it's a really interesting moment now where more and more the friction of going from, ideation to final product, there's a lot of like of that friction, that technical development that's been removed. And it's a double-edged sword that we can speak to in a second. But the fact of the matter is, this creation is more accessible because some of the technical barriers are removed. And I think one of the things that you might not have been saying, but this is what kind of resonates to me, is the access to this information, in the context of what an individual's goals might be, really allows them to get to that, N of one, recipe for, achieving one's, certainly their health goals. And, I'm really trying to get as much mileage as we can out of the athlete example, because, I saw that front and center when I worked with the track and field Olympic athletes. Is you even have 100-meter runners that, I mean, all you got to do is start at the beginning and run 100 meters and stay in between the lines, and shouldn't be that hard, right? It shouldn't be, the training should be pretty straightforward. It's like, well, actually, sprinting is one of the most, beautifully orchestrated dances you could put the human body through, because it's at the maximum, intensity and speed of contact, and everybody's body is different, and so the protocols and the plans that they would use would be based, like, first and foremost on the coach's eye. But the organization Altis that we were collaborating with, is they were trying to make that methodology democratized and available at scale. And you'll notice I said methodology. It's not a method. It's a learning methodology of getting to know the human and switching the paradigm of the drill sergeant coach to more of a gardener. And that really got into understanding, well, where are the vulnerabilities? And so you would actually have athletes with a high injury vulnerability as it relates to some DNA markers, but they'd still win gold medals by avoiding injuries because their coaches could create that plan. And so, that's not a clinical application, let's say, of the molecular diagnostics, which is why I kind of pushed on it, because I think there's so many different areas of opportunity in human development. That is of youth. I think certainly like longevity and health span is a hot topic right now, that there's a ton of dollars into that. Like, how do we increase, health span? How do we get to 100 healthy years? And, I sense that some of the work that you're doing is like getting to the root of some of these, unseen variables and making them seen earlier. And so that you can implement the habits. Like, for example, if I have a risk of type 2 diabetes or cardiometabolic health risk, if I had known that 20 years ago, that just would have been, those habits would have been built into the daily. Right. So anyway, I'm just kind of echoing back where I think, obviously you're preaching to the choir, so to speak, but I'm really interested to see or learn from you, like, what is, some of the changes that you've noticed probably in the last decade, and probably last 2 or 3 years in particular, insofar as who's coming to market that you would think 10, 20 years ago, no way, right? And maybe a simple jumping off point might be more of a background on what does molecular testing labs do. And because I didn't know what you guys did until, we had our conversation. I'm like, whoa, you guys are kind of the, silent facilitator making a lot of amazing things happen. So love to learn more, have our listeners hear about what molecular testing labs like actually does, and then some of the shifts that you've seen in the last few years that are, let's say, getting you to think, optimistically about this market making affinity that you have.
Yeah. So the old two-part question on a podcast, let's see if I can track on both. But molecular testing labs, we decided that being disruptive or transformative is not necessarily in our nature. So the way that we think about approaching the market is there is a healthcare system that works for some. There's a healthcare system that doesn't work for others. And so we're trying to focus on the others. What I mean by that is if care is occurring through health benefits and through a primary care or some kind of specialist, we're not trying to disrupt that at all. We're not trying to provide lab results to that. It's working, it's effective, great. But there's people in the margins that don't have access to care, and that's what we're focused on. So the way that we think of ourselves is we're a B2B company. We enable other people's strategy. That strategy looks different for every company, but ultimately it is if there is a diagnostic result required that has friction in that process. So there's barriers, there's economic, there's geographic, there's mistrust barriers, there's stigma barriers, etc. If there's a barrier to care where a diagnostic is required, we want to eliminate that barrier or that friction and get people to have access to a result so that it can lead to a better care journey. So we are stealthy. We do everything kind of behind the scenes, but we do the diagnostics. We have an R&D team. So if one of our customers wants to validate something new that's never been done on a self-collect test, we work on that with them, scope it out, deliver a test that meets their needs. We have kitting and logistics and fulfillment. And then, of course, you can't be in healthcare these days without some kind of technology infrastructure. And so for a long time, healthcare was all delivered through EMR results. Now, healthcare is being delivered through APIs, you know, platforms and portals and connectivity to how the patient is getting their care. So, what we did is in 2017, we started in the HIV and STI space because we identified that that was the biggest barriers to care. So, you have economic and geographic barriers, but the stigma and mistrust is really high. Makes sense. So, people that were having unprotected sex would not go to a doctor and talk about their behaviors and say, I need to have a test. And so, we wanted to address that barrier first. And it was overwhelming how fast the market caught on to that. And then later into 2019, we started getting into chronic disease management, like colorectal cancer screens, HbA1c, kidney, you hear it called KED, CKD, kidney dysfunction. Started getting into those chronic disease markers. And then now, just with where the market is going, we're getting more and more into health and wellness. So hormone testing, thyroid testing, a lot of TRT, HRT topics, a lot of GLP weight loss topics. So we've really expanded our menu to meet all of these indications. So the second part to your question is like, what has changed? Well, going back 20 years, there was a value proposition to healthcare. And I think that value proposition to healthcare has changed pretty significantly, or the value proposition of it has eroded. And so there was a time that you could for some reasonable copay or deductible, you could go to your primary care doctor and you could get care. And if part of that care was you need a test, then you get an order for it. You go to the lab, you get your test results. They call it back to the doctor, and you get your results. Now, for a lot of different reasons, I'm going to hit on that in a minute. What do I think are the reasons? But now, because that value proposition has eroded, most people that have health insurance, they have a $5,000 or $10,000 deductible. If they're generally healthy, they're never going to meet it, and so they don't engage in care. Also, the primary care doctor is only going to spend 10 minutes with them. They're not going to talk about preventative care. They're not going to talk about health and wellness. They're going to treat the sickness, and that's what we're going to focus on. When you move care to a more consumer-centric space, you're essentially taking what I consider the paternal instinct of healthcare and transforming it into a decision maker care model. So the patient is sick in this model. In this model of consumer care, the consumer is well, and we're trying to keep them well. And so here's some of the reasons why I think that matters is this incumbent healthcare system is well established and it's a capital market. So the leadership of these companies are geared for one thing, and that is protecting their shareholder value. In this new emerging business, you have consumer care where people don't have established margins and shareholder value and things that they're trying to protect. They're thinking about, how do I ultimately get to the customer or the consumer? How do I keep them well? How do I give them the tools that they need to stay well or to be healthy? And so I'll wrap up this answer with, it's almost as if we have two completely independent healthcare ecosystems, one for incumbent healthcare systems and sick care, one for consumerized healthcare. This is your wearable tech, this is your virtual care, this is your in-home care, things like that. At some point, and I think it's already starting to happen, is both of these systems, this system has to figure out how to reduce cost, because that's the only meaningful innovation that they can work on. I should not say the only, but it's a meaningful innovation that they can work on. This is really fragmented. There's a ton of companies entering the space. There's lots of disruptors. All of those companies will not make it. And so this one is looking for the size and scale that this one has. And so ultimately, you're going to see these two disparate systems start to merge and start to adopt technologies and patient load. And what I'm excited about is there's a new feeling in healthcare where we're talking about chronic disease. We're talking about obesity. We're talking about access and affordability. And so there's a new healthcare system that will emerge from that, where, in my mind, it's a blending of the two disparate systems where they start to join forces. And I think we always talk about consolidation in the fragmented consumer healthcare space, but it seems evident to me that the consolidation that will occur is from the big healthcare systems, with all of the fragmented point solutions and platform solutions here, to change the conversation into sick care into something that is more platform solutions focused on enablement of patients and an activation of patients to get them to do what they need to do to care for their health.
Mhm.
How
Mhm.
does how does that track for you?
I like that. And it makes me like, just to make it like a practical example. So I'm in Canada right now, and our healthcare system is different, and it is not without its challenges of, let's say, access, because there's strain as there is on any system. So anyway, I had a kind of this like weird persistent tinnitus that I could kind of identify back to a trigger point where I had a cold or an infection at some point last year. And, I get into my GP and he's like, okay, well, let's get you into the ENT. And it's like, well, that's about an 18-month wait. And I was like, oh, okay, well, why? And it's like, well, part of it is because, you have to get your hearing test done, and there's backup there. And it just so happened that there was like a private hearing testing clinic that opened up right around the corner from where we were living. I was like, well, I'll just go in there. And so then I got that in the next week. And by the way, it was actually free because they were selling solutions for people with chronic tinnitus, which I don't yet have. So anyway, I was able to get the test in days and not months, and then throw that into my file. And then my docs updates my file at the ENT, and then I get in 18 days instead of 18 months, just because of that one, trigger. Now the thing that happened is once I got in there, the ENT doc looks at my stuff and he's like, oh, well, but this isn't from an accredited lab, right? This isn't from an accredited hearing test lab. And he's like, but like, the notes that the examiner made are really sophisticated, which is why I'm inclined to believe them. And it turns out that, she was a former ENT nurse practitioner.
Okay.
So anyway, the point is he had my result, but it didn't tick the box as being a qualified result. But we kind of got around. He's like, well, I'll send you back in just to get it, to confirm what we think is true. And then I can go forward with the diagnosis. So anyway, one of the challenges that I see, and I've run into something similar like this before, is like, well, you need an MRI to get, the ortho to, diagnose you. But it's like, it's only with these so-called accredited partners. And so the private lab doesn't fall under that purview. And anyway, so it creates, basically an inefficiency. And so coming back to your point about the fragmentation, right? It's like, how do you ensure that the practitioner like believes the results? And maybe actually they don't have to. Maybe it's like, well, you know what? You did get that result, and I think it's a false positive or a false negative, but I'm glad that you had this result. Let's just double check to confirm. And that actually might be, now that I say it out loud, like a nice little kind of system check that gets baked in, right? So I guess like really to kind of push on your point, it's like there's all of this fragmentation, different models that are being applied to the different sensors that are out there, right? And I just talked about like the imagery, like different MRI lab practices, or I talk about, a hearing test or an eye test. And so I think that, yeah, my sense is that there's an opportunity here for like a new kind of standardization, and I know like we talk a little bit about your laboratory best practices, for example, are all CLIA CAP, right? So, um, do you see that as like the way you described it? These, I was like thinking about two galaxies that were just about to merge. You know what I mean? The Milky Way and then the Andromeda galaxy, like it's happening. So I guess the question is a star in the Andromeda galaxy the same as a star in the Milky Way galaxy? And how do we give the practitioners who are part of the established system today the confidence that these new labs that are popping up, effectively have the efficacy that they're used to?
Okay, so I'm going to take that as a two-part question too. So I want to go back to the very first thing you said. I'm from Canada and our system is different. I use the Canadian market all the time as a point of confirmation that what I'm saying is right. Canada still has massive geography barriers because the population is consolidated into the urban areas of Canada. Canada government runs the healthcare system, and Canada, as a federal agency, the federal healthcare system there is light years away from where we are, light years ahead of where we are on self-collect testing. So they're enabling HPV is one of the big things that they're enabling now. They are making significant investments into the infrastructure of that. Why are they so far ahead of us? I believe that it is because of the federal market running healthcare versus capital markets running healthcare. And I'm in no way saying one's right, one's wrong, one's better, one's worse. I'm just saying that when you have, and in our Senate committee hearing meetings are about publicly traded healthcare companies right now. There's a lot of focus on that. So I've been saying this for years, but it's coming to light. Like, should healthcare companies, like insurance companies that are providing benefits for people, should they be allowed to be publicly traded where you may place value over shareholder margin and balance sheet over care? And so it's not a conversation I want to get into, but I do think that that is one of the, I want to use the word retardants as in like a fire retardant or something that delays or suffocates. It prevents the emergence of new technology where we're focused on creating access to care and affordability to care. And so I think it's worth just pushing on collecting the data, understanding what's driving the behaviors, and just push on it. To answer your question about efficacy of testing, in general, when we do a validation, let's say we're doing a dried blood validation, we take wet blood samples and dried blood samples at the exact same time, and we correlate the results. And everything that we do either meets CLSI guidelines or New York State authorization guidelines through CLEP or CAP-CLIA guidelines. And so there's a lot of ways that you can look at this testing. And I do think a hurdle that we still have in front of us is getting the doctor networks of the United States to take this result and make clinical decisions off of that. But I don't think that's what we're selling right now. I think what we're selling is a decision making tool. So, in the historically speaking, a patient has to go to a doctor's office to get an order to get a lab. Well, I'm an educated person and like I told you, I'm generally healthy. I'm not going to hit my deductible. I don't want to go through this convoluted cycle that requires me to take time off work to go get a lab result. That's nonsense for me. I need to know, are my lipids, triglycerides, are they elevated so that then I can make a decision on what to do next. And also like through the process of getting a kit through one of our channel partners, there's always 100% of the time, there's physician networks involved in that process. The patient may not feel it on the front end, but if there's an abnormal result, like a detected STI or an elevated A1C or a high risk triglyceride result, they're going to get contacted by a doctor that is licensed in their state and give them a consultation on what their options are to do next. And so one of the options might be, hey, you had a bad test. We're concerned about this result. Let's send you to a bigger reference lab and just confirm that now that we know, now that we have this suspicion. And so we're selling a decision tool. Again, I said, paternal, the old healthcare system is paternal. The consumerized healthcare system is driving decision making down to the consumer level. And so we think that it's realistic to put the decision making tools in patients' hand in consultation with their doctor. It doesn't mean that it has to follow that workflow 100% of the time. Sometimes we would create workflows that lead with a test. Sometimes we're creating workflows that lead with a doctor visit through a virtual care setting. And I say this, I wish I had a dollar for every time I say this, but it's not realistic to think that someone that's accessing their care virtually is willing to go to a lab. There's a reason that they are prevented from getting in-person care. So let's meet that consumer, let's meet that patient where they are. Let's get them a diagnostic result that they need, and let's improve their care journey. And so what you're seeing now, because we're kind of in this orbit of like, where's healthcare going and how does diagnostics help that? You've got this is way oversimplified, but just follow me on this. So you got three legs to the stool. You've got doctor care, doctor oversight, consultation, follow up, and linkage to care. You've got pharmacy and you've got labs. And historically, what happens is big companies go to create a more consumer centric healthcare ecosystem or platform for their employees or for the consumers to meet a need. Historically, they haven't thought about how to connect the lab and the pharmacy. Or if they did think about it, they thought about how to connect doctor patient pharmacy, but they used and relied on this outdated infrastructure for labs. And they didn't think about that. Well, now there's new companies spending, I can't even imagine how much money they're spending on marketing, but they're creating awareness of how you can do labs differently. And so um, I am a huge fan of the diagnostic market right now. I'm a huge fan of how telehealth in the United States just got an extension. We were at a point where maybe it goes away, maybe it doesn't, but it got an extension. So we have a government that's still focused on access and affordability and convenience being part of that. Um, as as those companies develop and they start to think about how to engage a patient in the entire care journey, they've got to start thinking differently about the labs. Even to the point where you see big pharma in the US is starting to go direct to consumer. Why? To make it more affordable. So one of the levers that they have to be more affordable in care is to cut out some of the middleman, which means go direct to consumer. What do you need for a prescription? Generally, a lab result. And so as we make these incremental steps into thinking about how diagnostics get used differently, we can engage the whole pie of the population as opposed to just the part of the pie that goes to their doctor. Because you can give them the tools, you can give them an access point through their social media, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, whatever, of, "Hey, do you wanna know if you have elevated triglycerides? Take this test." And there's channel partners of ours that are out marketing that. Makes it incredibly simple and affordable, which are, the two most effective patient activators that you can get is this going to be convenient for me, and is it affordable? And I can make that decision on my own. Check. I'll buy that kit, I'll get my result, and then decide what to do from there. Does
Yeah.
that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, it does. And even like hearing you speak to the tripod, basically the ordering physician, the labs, and the pharmacy. It's interesting to think that, or it's exciting to think that, having your own kind of portable record of that over time where, something like your whole genome results as an example. So, I mean, I have the privilege of, been thinking about DNA for 25 years. I did my
Yeah.
PhD in molecular biology. And so I might not be the, you know, kind of average person in that respect. But I think that, one of the missions of this podcast is to make that, you know, um, knowledge and accessibility to like one's own biology, um, universal, right? And that's getting really exciting with all these digital tools around, education. But take, for example, it's like, okay, well, I have my whole genome and I've analyzed it every, way since Sunday. Um, so when I go in and I'm getting a knee surgery from an injury that I had, and the anesthesiologist comes out and he says, "Hey, so do you have any drug allergies?" I've had a few surgeries, and my running joke was always, "I don't know, I haven't tried them all." But then now, actually, I had this whole genome sequence, and I had my pharmacogenetic results, and I was about to tell that joke, and I said, "Wait a minute, I can actually answer this question now."
Mhm.
And so it doesn't have to be this like massive report because I have like a I can basically I have my own personal LLM of my data. And then I can ask the question and I asked the doc, I was like, okay, what's my drug plan? What are you thinking of giving me? And so then I load that in and then the result comes back and it's like, oh, Celebrex actually is flagged as one of the ones that you're a slow metabolizer and therefore negative responder. That paired with, a genetic predisposition to develop cardiometabolic health, which, thankfully I'm ahead of, is not a good combination. And actually, when I look back to, I remember a wearable result that I had when taking Celebrex for inflammation previously. It's like, oh, wow, I have a resting heart rate of like 140, 160. What's going on? Right. And so, there is an example of, something like a whole genome sequence analysis that you do once, but then as the research is, constantly improving, you get to reanalyze your genome in the context of new research, but then, just as importantly, in the new context that you might face. Like, so the context of the way I would analyze my genome as an athlete competing at the Olympic trials is very different in the context that I'm now analyzing it, to be the best that I can in the long term for my children, my daughter, right? I mean, so that to me is really exciting. And so when I look at, these different providers that are out there, like I was, an early adopter, certainly of, 23andMe. And then you have, now organizations like Function. It's really interesting that like this data is available where, as you were saying, as a proactive measure, you're not even getting it because there's anything wrong per se, but it's like, hey, here's like an encyclopedia on me that you don't know when that information would become valuable. Like another example is like when I had appendicitis and I was at the doctor and when I was, competing, my resting heart rate was 40. So when I go in and I'm presenting with a 70, 80%, it's like, no, you're okay. You're going to triage you as not the priority. And so then my appendix actually ruptured, right? Because my resting heart rate elevated is like, that would be like an average person with a 120, for example. So I think that like that's a really exciting layer as well as like you develop your own personal LLM through time. So anyway, I guess where this kind of dovetails nicely into like, for example, like there's GPT Health, right? And they actually did a really good job of I don't know if you saw their marketing video,
Mhm.
but it was really like, hey, like I know me and I know the context outside of the clinic. And I'm not trying to diagnose myself, but I can bring now all this information in context and have a conversation, with the clinician, offering context that they wouldn't normally have. And so interestingly, I think we kind of got there is like that merger of the, proactive versus reactive care. Like that's when they come together where it's like, oh, like you're actually here on something that is seemingly routine, but wait a minute, there's this data point that's unique to you, your drug allergy, notoriously low resting heart rate. Yeah. So to me, it's like, it's fascinating, but then I think I want to pull on a thread that I think I heard you start to allude to, which is the care is moving to like an outcomes based care. And I've heard that a lot on, conversations I've had on the show, where the old way was kind of minutes in a visit, right? Like practitioner is allocated 15 to 30 minutes, depending on where you're at. But, now it's like moving to like a specific, outcome in the case of an individual looking to do something proactive. But the athlete is an obvious one. But, there's these things like these different age clocks. It's like, oh, well, how do I, increase or decrease my biological age? So I think there's like interesting, metrics that are pre-patient, right? That are emerging, and, um, kind of maybe moving on that proactive thread, pulling on that a little bit more. How are you seeing that unfold, even in connecting to the outcomes of the solutions, right? Because it's, we in the stool that you described, it's the clinician, the test, and then the drug therapeutic. Well, now it might be the clinician, which doesn't necessarily need to be your family doc. Like it might be your, I don't know, your athletic therapist, or your you know, physio, whatever. And then, the test is still going to require the efficacy, but now the activity isn't necessarily take the therapeutic. It might be, take the supplement. It might be get more sunshine. It might be do this specific physical exercise, but like connected to an activity that is, enabling health span, is like tracking us to those 100 years of health span. So what does that area look like, to you, in terms of like any players that you've seen come to the market that you're particularly excited about?
Those are some really great thoughts. How do I think about it? I want to go back to, I'll start with affordability, which was not really your question, but I'm going to answer it that way. So the genomic testing is becoming more and more affordable, and the genomic data, like you mentioned pharmacogenomics. I think that's a great indication for genomic data because it gives you insights. And now the commercials that you see, I don't know if this is true in Canada, but in the US, you actually see recommendations in the commercial for CYP testing, SIP testing before you take a medication, which is incredible
It is.
because they're telling you if you have a hypermetabolizer or hypometabolizer that you're going to have adverse effects that they're listing off in the commercial. Get your pharmacogenomic test done. The genome testing is getting really affordable, which means it's becoming more accessible, which means you can actually start to identify all of your deficiencies, how you metabolize drugs, to how you respond to exercise, to how you respond to eating your broccoli, to how you respond to what kind of vitamins and minerals you need to supplement for your deficiencies, to what kind of cancers you're most likely to take on. And the way I look at it is you've got the genome testing, which has historically been companies that only focus on genome testing. And that's kind of a point solution. You can either do next gen sequencing, whole genome sequencing, or SNP testing, and depending on what level of detail you're trying to get to. You've got your biomarker testing, like the functions and the rhythms and goodness, SciFox. Like there's tons of companies coming out in that space that are looking at biomarkers. And then you said it, GPT Health is incredible. It's a really good tool. And this isn't necessarily my opinion. This is a popular opinion, but a lot of the companies that are focused on AI in the healthcare spectrum, if they're focused on just creating their own internal AI, like those companies they have a problem. And that's the ones that have market share in AI, that have so much scale and data and, size to their learning capabilities, like Gemini, GPT, Claude, whatever, they're going to gobble up everybody. And so to me, like creating your own AI solution for healthcare is silliness right now because you won't outpace the big market share leaders. And so what you have now is these three tools: genome testing, biomarker testing, and AI, to kind of complete the person, complete the picture. And so you get this view of deficiencies that you need to compensate for so that you can be normal, so that you can operate at an optimal human level. The AI can feed that. And to your point, you're constantly getting new publications and new data that's going into the meta-analysis for what to do with that genomic data, and it's going to change now all the way to 100 years from now of, like, what we know about the body and how you respond to stresses and diet and exercise, etcetera. And then now you have the biomarker testing that you can enable into that whole complete picture so that you're getting benchmarking and baseline data about what you're how you operate is a that was a problem 5 years ago we could not solve, today we can solve. And what molecular testing labs is trying to do is be that whole platform solution for the diagnostics so that we can enable any of our partners to do the genome sequencing all the way to the biomarker testing. They can dump it into their AI models, either internal, external, doesn't matter, and then create these insights for employees and consumers. You called it pre-patients, I call it consumers, for what behaviors they need to exhibit. And what a time to be alive that you can get passionately curious about your healthcare right now. And there's plenty of tools and they're all becoming more and more affordable. Everything is changing so fast. And of course, the adoption of technology just accelerates change. If you are a consumer and you want to know how to be healthy and feel better, just get in the game. There's so many people that will advertise to you. Just start searching, what do you want to accomplish in your goals? And somebody's going to reach out to you with a paid ad for how you do that and how they're going to help you. Like, get in the game. It's time.
Wow. Wow. Just to kind of make sure I understood, like, because I'm thinking about molecular testing labs and where I was, let's say 10 years ago. So I started a venture, which was basically like helping athletes get insight into their injury vulnerability, right? Having had so many injuries, I was like, you know what? Like a good kind of legacy would be like less athletes get injured after this work that I do. And, it was really like a simple solution, which was, looking at all the known injury vulnerability markers available. And that was, what we put in front of coaches to just kind of be aware. It's like, hey, here's where the quicksand is. And, there is like a fair amount of, I'd say there's a bit of an art insofar as like how you turn that into the activities, turn that into the habits, right? Because what you don't want is that same 100-meter sprinter, that long jumper thinking on the start line, oh, like I could rupture my Achilles tendon. I have a greater vulnerability. It's like, what instead is you want is like feeling confident that they've corrected for those vulnerabilities in all of their training. And if that injury was going to happen, it was likely going to happen in, you know, in training, because that's what we were doing those simulations. But I had to create the kit, like source the materials for the boxes. I had to build the logistics, shipping and tracking. I had to vet the lab. I had to build the infrastructure to house the data. And then at the end of the day, I was spending the least amount of time on the thing that was the unfair advantage that I was trying to deliver, which was the subject matter expert knowledge on
Yeah.
athletes in track and field, right? But I think what I'm hearing you say is like, yeah, Jeremy, all that time that you spent, like the years and the millions of dollars, it's like, yeah, now that's available, right? Like basically the shipping, the kitting. I think you have an LDT, so you can actually develop tests with your partners. Because I think that's an interesting area that to me is emergent from all of this like technology and all of this support, is like the evidence based expert practitioner who's, you know, basically been delivering patient or athlete or, wellness care. Like they do have like an interesting subset of individuals that they're hoping to empower to achieve their goals. And what I see with like your testing labs is like, okay, well, that human that has that insight is like, it's like a Mr. Miyagi Karate Kid moment where you can now like scale Mr. Miyagi to like thousands as a practitioner, or tens of thousands. So I think that, like, to me, that's a really interesting thing too, is you, like, ironically, the technology, people might fear that you would lose the relationship with human. It might actually be used as an enablement for more of this intimacy, because now I can actually focus on like really you and see you. And, I don't have to spend years and millions of dollars to get there because of solutions like, yeah, molecular testing lab. So am I right? Did I capture that? Like you guys are that end to end solution, like any biomarker, any like whole genome sequence solution, the kitting, like everything is now
Everything.
available for anybody to get in the game.
Yeah, you nailed it. So we've been doing this for 11 years. Well, we've been a lab for 14 years. We've been doing self-collection testing and enabling that for 11 years. And we have developed a workflow and patient journey for every indication that you can imagine. So big pharma, pharmacy, retail health, virtual health, public health, digital health, you name it. We have a workflow. So if you come to us, you don't have to think about how to build that workflow. You don't have to be creative. Like we want to do that work for you. You tell us what you're trying to do to engage, activate, and nurture your patient. And we're going to give you the insights of what's been working and effective over the last 11 years. So more than a decade we've been doing this.
Wow.
So, one of the stifling factors, I said it earlier, but I'll go a little bit deeper here. Labs are thought of as traditional infrastructure. Labs no longer have to be thought of like that. And so if you know that you need to activate or engage your patients in a different way and it requires labs, it's time to think different about that. And again, we're not trying to disrupt, we're trying to supplement. So we want to enable the patients that have a barrier to care through a digital workflow. And we know exactly how to do that, how to set it up. We customize everything for you from artwork to the workflows. And then if you don't need any point of it or any part of the full solution, we just nix that in the statement of work and give you what you need. And so the whole goal of it is if we've done our job well, you're getting a lab result that you need for your care or for your model as a part of your strategy. And you're doing it in a consumer friendly way that's convenient, it's affordable, and we've done everything that we can to lower the cost of that engagement so that you get the results that you need.
Amazing. James, I want to be cognizant of time because I know you're highly sought after, and I want to
Flattering, thank you.
respect the timeline that um, we agreed to. And so I do have, my three favorite questions that I promised, and I think where you had just finished is a great segue of, like what is the key takeaway that we got to hear on this podcast that people need to, and then so that's number one, and then number two is who needs to hear it most. And then number three, I would ask is who would you nominate as my next guest?
Okay. Key takeaway. I think I already said it. Get in the game. Get in the game. There's tools galore right now. Healthcare is changing. It's becoming more convenient. It's becoming more accessible and affordable. Get in the game. Like just start to get curious about what you need to do to be healthy, to be happy and healthy. Who would this message impact or would I want them to hear? It would be, I want to say my dad because I wish he was healthier, but I don't think he's going to listen to your podcast because I don't think he listens to any podcast. But I think it would be the 40-year-olds that are doom scrolling and depressed and tired all the time to just say you can be happier, you can be healthier, you can be vibrant, you can be light. So just take care of yourself, get curious, reach out and understand what tools you have available to just be happy and healthy and just mentally aware. And then for your next guest, one of my very good friends who is just trailblazing in diagnostics right now. He is a pioneer in thought leadership for diagnostics, which I think applies to your podcast very well. Eliad Josephson. He actually created a diagnostic zone at the health conference, HLTH, which is a consumer focused healthcare company. I love him to death. He's a dear friend of mine. I'll give you his digits and you can reach out to him and get him on your show.
You know what? I've had Elliot.
Is that right?
Yeah, it is. And you're right. He's a gem. So his ears must be burning right now. So I'll definitely mention that you brought up his name.
He is a wonderful human.
Yeah.
I really care for him a lot.
Yeah. And we are set to have another conversation. So this will preempt me to set that up sooner rather than later. So James, thank you so much for, everything that you have done, are doing, and will do, and for your time today and joining me on the show.
Thank you, Jeremy. I think these platforms matter. They shine a light on different ways to think about healthcare right now, and I'm excited to support it in any way that I can.
Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have traveled with James today from the macro scale of global markets to the micro scale of a single blood spot, witnessing the evolution of a man and an industry dedicated to human flourishing. James's story is a testament to what happens when we stop accepting good enough and start building what is necessary. He has shown us that the future of well care isn't a distant dream. It's an infrastructure being built right now with the consumer at its heart. As you reflect on this arc, we ask that you define yourself in your own story. Are you ready to move from the sidelines and, as James says, get into the game? The tools to read your own biological encyclopedia are here, turning mystery into actionable insight. Your next chapter isn't about waiting for a diagnosis, it's about stepping into the responsibility of your own design. The thread is in your hands, it's time to activate it. Thanks for joining me this week on the DNA of Things. I'm Dr. Jeremy Koenig, and we'll see you next time.